you can call me Daddy. And if you want to follow me on Facebook, you can find me at james.desborough, Postmortem Studios, all one word, JD Writer and JGD Games. Hello lovelies. If you're a nerd of a certain vintage, like me, then you probably have a lot of love for the 1970s book covers by the likes of Chris Foss and so on, and these have had a long cultural reach, these depictions. They influenced Homeworld, for example, and numerous other games and titles and God knows what else. Traveller has had homages to this kind of art on its covers for some time, and it's very much that. While the art was often more rounded and a bit more abstract, the 70s science fiction world that it described was much more hard science fiction. So, like many children born in the 70s and before, I grew up around a lot of hard science fiction, much of it in the form of small paperback novels, with these semi-abstract and eye-catching covers. Whether they were in the shops or legacy books from charity stores and so on, you found them around. In younger days, I might conflate all of these different books, all of these different covers, and the cover and the content didn't necessarily relate, but I might kind of combine all of that in my head into some sort of science fiction metaverse, where all these things happened side by side. All these spaceships existed in the same universe and could face off against each other. And apparently the same sort of idea struck a guy named Stewart Cowley in around 1978, so towards the end of the 70s. He recycled a lot of the artwork from those covers, commissioned a few new ones, I think, and strung the whole lot together in a series of art books that held a vision of the future, and which he strung together with more sort of documentary style writing. And this was the Terran Trade Authority, and that universe was then born. This was a future history, compelling in the authority with which it was written and its consistency across the books, even if the art wasn't particularly consistent. I always wanted to play around in the Terran Trade Authority universe. My attempts were all spaceship combat games, mostly derived from Full Thrust, which is an excellent game that you should all purchase for your spaceship battles. Eventually, a role-playing game came out, and this was Morrigan Press's Terran Trade Authority RPG, which many of you have probably not heard of. And that's part of the reason why I think it didn't particularly succeed. So I'm going to kind of review the Morrigan Press book, even though it's out of print, talk a little bit more about the Terran Trade Authority, and point you at the Battlefield Press sourcebook for the Terran Trade Authority for Savage Worlds. The RPG book, the initial one by Morrigan Press, does deliver a role-playing background of a future history that is second only to Traveller, but it does feel a bit less flexible, and the effort that went into that publication and later publications, unfortunately, just hasn't really lived up to the source material. The Morrigan Press RPG, which you're going to have to pirate if you want to get hold of it anymore, it's a pretty damn hefty book at something over 400 pages. The hard copy I don't think is still available easily. There might be a few second-hand copies kicking around or some leftover stock or something. But you can really only get hold of it and its scant supplementary material by scouring the internet and pirating it. I wouldn't normally say that's something that you should do, but if you want to get hold of it, it's really your only option at this point. A big part of this hefty size that the book has is down to a single column, large font text throughout the book. Now this imitates the original art books, storybooks, in its format, but in terms of presenting RPG information, it can't help but feel pretty wasteful of real estate on the page. even if the original price of the book wasn't particularly high, it did feel like a lot of wasted space and a high page count without there being a real reason for there to be a high page count. The RPG, the Morrigan Press one, is packed with information, combining the RPG information with most of the data from local space 2200 AD and spacecraft 2100 to 2200, though in the case of those non-RPG books there's a modicum of extra detail that's been cut to make room for role-playing material. The Morrigan Press version uses Morrigan Press's Omni system, which is a rather generic by-the-numbers system that uses a D20 roll to resolve just about everything. It's an entirely generic system which they use in subtly different form in their other games, so if you're familiar with it at all, you're not going to see anything particularly outlandish or different here. The artwork in the Morrigan Press book will mostly be familiar to anyone who knows the TTA. Still, probably you will notice something a bit different about it. The original scenes and starships are recreated, but they're recreated using computer modelling and ray tracing techniques. While this does look okay in and of itself, it seems strange to have copied and translated the original art into CGI form rather than just using the original art, much of which is old, much of which has a long history of being licensed for other projects. Psygnosis used to use a lot of this art on the covers of their computer games in the 80s and early 90s. Perhaps there were licensing issues, perhaps there were problems with the artists' estates or tracking down the originals to get good copies. Who knows? But you would think that slavishly copying the originals in computer form would have thrown up those same issues as well if you're copying the work. Either way, it's good to see the old images, even in a new form, but I do think something is lost in the transferal from paint to digital media. I'm not against computer graphics in any way, necessarily, other than people producing tons of cheap poser art for their RPG books. But they're just not up to the original standard as they're presented in this book. There are 3 styles of artwork in the Morrigan Press book overall. The ship renders, which approximate the original artwork but lack something. The sketch style, naturalist illustrations of the 3 races, humans, Alphans and Proximans. And thirdly, the equipment sketches, which look a bit more like computer-aided design images. Each of these styles works on its own, but they don't really feel like they work synergistically, and that's largely down to the CGI of the ships. If they had been drawn or painted or repainted, or the original work had been used, the whole thing would hang together a lot better. The layout of the book is rather pedestrian, but it does recall the original books. I just don't think it's a particularly good use of the space and the page, and the use of larger fonts makes the book seem drastically over bloated, even as an easily searchable PDF. Like the original books, there's no real fiction presented in the Terran Trade Authority RPG. Everything is instead told in a sort of matter-of-fact historical reporting sort of way, or a scientific manner. Even though it is make-believe and therefore it's all fiction, it's presented in a way that is very non-fiction, like an account of the Second World War or a technical description of a gun or a ship or whatever else it might be. You never get something like Mac tightened his hand on the control rod and sighted up the Proximan Raider. You don't get anything like that. The closest you get are somewhat in-character reports written by fictional people. There's no fiction in the moment, I guess, is what I'm saying. This does help make the background feel much more real and substantial, and it can make for an easier, if a somewhat drier read, since personal taste in fiction doesn't come into it so much and important details aren't buried in a bunch of lurid purple prose. Everything is well explained, clearly and straightforwardly, and the larger text does help with absorbing that to an extent. as your eye does wander, like it will with smaller text, but the larger text makes it more easily absorbable. So maybe this was a deliberate choice, who knows. The background of the game and the Terran Trade Authority as a whole is a universe at the beginning of man's expansion out into it, and that of similar races relatively nearby into the galaxy as a whole. Relatively few planets and stars have been mapped and explored, and even fewer colonies have been created, but already there's been one interstellar war, and numerous strange anomalies have been found throughout the galaxy already in this fairly limited amount of exploration. One of those significant anomalies is an apparent common genetic heritage between humans, Alphans, and Proximans, the three intelligent species that have intermingled so far. The game, in the Morrigan Press instance, picks up at the end of the Proxima War. So there's terrorism, there's piracy, there's discontented nationalists, corporate interests. All of that sort of combines in the game world, which maximizes opportunities for adventures. You could very easily set the game earlier, before or during the Proximan War, with no real problems whatsoever. However, the book is lacking the development of the game world onwards into the later books like Great Space Battles, which is the book I really preferred out of the original TTA series. Humans are pretty much humans as they are today, though the world has changed a great deal. The original background of the TTA still mentioned the USSR, all these kind of things from the 70s and 80s that we couldn't imagine would change even in the far future, and did. They have changed that in the Morrigan Press RPG, sort of updating the timeline and removing the anachronisms. But that's somewhat disappointing, I guess, but you can understand why. There's one world government on Earth. Trade from the mother world is what's overseen by one overarching world governmental body, the Terran Trade Authority, and its subset, the Terran Defense Authority. Now, I can hear all manner of people shrinking and shrieking in political terror from such an idea, but not to worry. There's rebels, secessionists, terrorists who've reacted in much the same way that you have, and this despite the necessity of a united world in this future setting. You could easily play one of those if you find the politics that are presented within the book to not be particularly to your taste. So as I said, the background has been tweaked somewhat from where it was. Nobody really foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union back then, and so a great many future histories kind of fell over or fell apart once the USSR disappeared. Despite this, I think they've done okay in doing this. There are still some potential problems with the new timeline, but it does feel more realistic, or at least will for 20 or 30 years, I suppose, and it feels a lot more up to date than the old background. But if you're really wedded to the old setting, it might be off-putting, and that has been one of the complaints about the Morrigan Press version that's gone around online. The Alphans are an arch-rationalist, elf-like, semi-tribal, polyandrous, and androgynous race. They seem to be every worst nightmare of Americans, of America's far-right Bible Belt, all kind of flung together in a single species. Despite this, I think they're quite well designed. While I'm not a fan of humanoid aliens exactly, the Alphan society seems different enough, well thought out enough, alien enough to be a source of rich roleplay possibility, as well as giving Bushun and Yaoi anime fans a character to play in the setting. The Proximans, by contrast, are a matriarchal but very conservative society, despite their inbuilt capability for gender switching and their acceptance of genetic modification. They also harbour deep religious convictions and beliefs, which puts them into a kind of natural conflict, most especially with the Alphans. The Proximans hail from a tide-locked planet, and they're far more satisfyingly alien than the Alphans are, at least in appearance. At the same time, Proximans' societal ideas and religious notions are depressingly familiar in today's world. While no particular hook is set out, and that is a failing of the book, it's my feeling that the characters in the game are best played as TTA or TDA agents, and they can then operate between the three different civilizations, explore the colonies. It gives them a broad remit to do a lot of things, guided and unguided. The rules are this Omni system, which is basically a D20 roll against a set range of results. The roll is modified by a variety of factors to give you a final different degree of success, from an abject failure through to a stunning success. Character creation is a simple business of applying templates over a sort of primary modified racial starting point. Doesn't take long at all, and does tend to give you a hook into your character's past, so it's quite good for quickly slapping together a character that does still otherwise have some sort of background to it. Combat wise, most things are pretty simple. Two knocks against the game, in my opinion, are the use of hit points, which I find too abstract, particularly in science fiction games, and the set damage level of weapons. Fixed damage through the system can only do half, full, or double damage. It just doesn't seem granular enough to me. It's too predictable. You know the outcome too much within those boundaries. Spaceships are treated pretty much the same way as characters, which is an excellent way to do space opera, but not necessarily such a good idea here. TTA is much more of a hard science fiction game, and by default a fairly military-oriented science fiction game. There isn't a huge broad swathe of ships on offer in the main book. It does advertise more ship information and add-ons, but those never emerged, really. You can still get hold of the character sheet here and there, and you can pirate the book. Unfortunately, it seems to be the only way to get there, but there isn't much out there, and most of what there was has gone. On the upside, the game is very nostalgic. It will give you the warm fuzzies if you're familiar with the TTA at all. The system's simple, easily understood, and it's a very complete core book. It would have to be at 400 pages, despite the wasted space and the layout and so on. On the downside, it's not available, save by piracy, and therefore only really in PDF form, though you can always do a private print job somewhere if you want a hard copy. The artistic reinvention of the wheel was unnecessary, and some of the interior art otherwise just isn't up to the mark, unfortunately. And there's no real clear adventurer concept or campaign concept there. You know, what do I do? It just isn't particularly clear in this book. Scores, I would give it a style of 3. CGI doesn't work, and a lot of the other illustration just isn't up to snuff, but yeah, it's good enough. Substance 4, it is chocker with information, everything you need. So that gives it an overall score of 3.5 out of 5. So yeah, a bit above average. So what happened here? What went wrong? Why has the Morrigan Press version of the TTA RPG vanished into the ether without ever producing its promised supplements? How did the game end up reinvented yet again, this time published by Battlefield Press as a setting for Savage Worlds? Well, it turns out that Hamlin, the original publishers of the books by Cowley, no longer had the rights to the series when they licensed them to Morrigan Press, and the rights had in fact reverted to Cowley in 1990, if I remember correctly. And this probably meant that the rights to the artwork used or reused had also reverted or come into question, and that may be part of what necessitated the CGI remakes, unfortunately. This meant that all the material related to the setting and the original books, spacecraft, 2000 to 2100 AD, Great Space Battle, Space Wreck, Starliners, Space Base 2000, etc., could not legally be used, and likely that also goes for the artwork by the likes of Jim Burns, Alan Daniels, Peter Elson, Fred Gambino, Colin Hay, Robin Hidden, Bob Lazell, Angus McKay, Chris Moore, Tony Roberts and Trevor Webb, and so on, likely also couldn't be used. Now, under Morrigan Press, they were slated to produce new art books and several new RPG books. These were to be Spacecraft 2100 to 2200 AD, Local Space, A Guide to the TTA Universe, Capital Ships of the TTA, Aliens of the TTA, the Terran Trade Authority role-playing game, Alpha Centauri and Proxima Centauri as books, either art books or RPG source books. Most of these weren't published, and those that were got a somewhat lukewarm reception, both from the RPG players that were aware of it, which wasn't enough people, and from fans of the original sort of art and story series. Many of them felt that the CGI images just weren't good enough, and the changes in the background were not for the better. Battlefield Press then acquired the rights and started over. I'm guessing Morrigan Press gave them up. They ran a Kickstarter campaign to produce a Savage Worlds and independent game system version of the Terran Trade Authority RPG, but the Kickstarter failed to fund. I never even heard of it, so I'm not that surprised. Nostalgia just ain't what it used to be, I suppose. They did eventually release a Savage Worlds setting book for the Terran Trade Authority, but limited to the Proxima War. Still, that escaped many people's notice, including mine, and it isn't obviously a setting book at first glance. Savage Worlds is also not necessarily the best system for a hard science fiction game. I did, nonetheless, spend money on your behalf and got a copy of Battlefield Press's version of the Terran Trade Authority, the Proxima War, to give you my take on that as well. So, Terran Trade Authority, the Proxima War, is the Battlefield Press Savage Worlds version of the setting. It's available on PDF and print on demand from Drive-Thru RPG, and so it has the advantage over the Morrigan Press version of still being in print, I suppose. As a small independent publisher myself, I don't like being particularly critical of other small publishers. I know how hard small press RPG publishing is, how thin the margins are, and the measures that you take to try and cut costs and still produce a good saleable item. However, I'm just not impressed at all with this book. At $15 for 99 pages, it's at the upper end of what I would be willing to spend for a PDF, and the level of production value, art, and the amount of content just don't really justify that price. It's another generic system, Savage Worlds, albeit one with a bit more of a pedigree than the Omni system. Savage Worlds is popular enough, but again, it's a system that's really much more suited to space opera or a more swashbuckling setting rather than the kind of hard-edged science fiction of the 70s. I don't think you would choose Savage Worlds to play an RPG derived from, say, Mass Effect, for example. That series of computer games shares a similar sort of inspirational pedigree to the TTA books. Now, you'd want something a bit more firm, a bit more plausible, a bit more hardline at the table. Something more suited to scaling from interpersonal action and combat right the way up to space battles. To my mind, that would naturally lead one to something like Silhouette or Traveller. Instead, we get Savage Worlds. Ah, well. The layout is a lot better than the Morrigan Press edition, but there is a lot of reused art. And again, sadly, not the original art, but the CGI art of the Morrigan Press era game and art books. They're passable, but there's also quite a bit of unsuitable stock art, and the few new illustrations are adequate but not good. If you're going to invoke a game setting and a series of books that depended so heavily on really high quality science fiction art, as the TTA originally did, then it feels to me like you should really make the effort and spend out the extra money to really knock it out of the park when it comes to art. But it's just not the case here. It's just adequate but not good. The game history seems to follow along with the Morrigan Press material in that it's a somewhat revised background, though it's not gone into as much detail in the Battlefield Press version. It turns the game more into a kind of alternate history setting in a way, because it does go back in our own timeline and changes things before the current day. So that's a little odd. There's some very good sound advice on playing with an alien mindset and unravelling cosmic mysteries, which seems to be a bit more where some of the emphasis in this is, despite the setting being the Proxima War. So that's good. And the campaign ideas and hooks are much more present, which is a distinct improvement over the Morrigan Press edition. At 99 pages as opposed to 400, there really isn't that much room to go deep on the background, which is part of the reason why I think they limited it to the period of the Proxima War. Without a full system, the book feels a little thin, even though you don't need it if you're using a generic system like Savage Worlds, where you have a separate core rulebook. But other sacrifices are made, including the broader background and the broader universe of the Terran Trade Authority and the politics and peculiarities. There just isn't the room to go into the detail, which beside the art was the other thing that really made the setting. Your mileage may vary, but I find military game campaigns to be tricky at the best of times. They can be a bit stifling of creativity with their chain of command, orders, missions, and they can seem very railroaded. Choosing to concentrate on the Proxima War as current rather than background may be a mistake, therefore, in this context. It's more work to take the Proxima War setting and turn it into a post or pre setting than it is with the original Morrigan Press RPG to take that, which is set after everything, and move it back into the Proxima War. It's a shame. So upsides, it's in print, it's clean and clear, it has good GM advice, it's pricey, it's incomplete, and it uses an unsuitable rule system. An unsuitable rule system. So final scores then. I give it 3.5 stars out of 5 for style. I give it 3 for substance. So overall that gives it a 3.25. I would, if you want to get your value for money, I suppose, get this and pirate the Morrigan Press version, which will fill in the background, and with a little bit of conversion from one system to the other or to another completely different system, you'll have a complete and usable game. It's a shame, because for people like me who are hugely nostalgic about this setting, about this artwork, it's just a shame that it never really took off. But I guess the audience just isn't there, and it's better served by things like Traveller. But then why not do it through one of the open versions of the Traveller system? Who knows? Zang. Pulp Nova is a collection of short stories in the old pulp style but with a modern twist. You should find something here you like, from western to mythos horror to science fiction. You can get Pulp Nova at Drive-Thru Fiction, on Amazon, or in hard copy from lulu.com.